To the topic for today. Some weeks ago, well, I guess about 2 weekends ago, I had already chosen the topic before George Floyd's death and the protests and all that sort of racked this country and caused us to shift our agenda. And the topic I had chosen proves, I think, still to be relevant. I had chosen to talk about Epictetus, a particular quote from Epictetus that I thought could be useful. So here, we'll start with the quote. His quote is, "Everything has two handles, the one by which it may be carried and the other by which it cannot. If your brother acts unjustly, don't lay hold on the action by the handle of his injustice, for it cannot be carried by that, but by the opposite, that he is your brother, that he is brought up with you. Thus you can lay hold of it and it can be carried." So that's the quote, that's the statement, that's the quick summary that I want to reflect on today. When we look out at the world at the moment, I think it can look a lot like the world is on fire. We're seeing a lot of different problems. Racial injustice has been thrust into the spotlight quite heavily, police brutality in particular, and the videos just keep coming. There's one after another. Every time you think that you've seen them, and everybody's going to behave for a little bit, we find one more of them, and one more comes up here or there. Places get burnt. There can be riots in response. People get fired. It's all kind of brutal. Even among all of that, there's economic turmoil. We're hearing about unemployment rates bouncing around. You can see stock markets bouncing around. The future of how this is going to land, where everyone's going to end up, is still very uncertain. It's hard to know what's happening in that area. And so that can be really disorienting to see all of this going on. It can be very angering. Within all of this, you're seeing a number of people have deliberate provocations where they're doing things in order to make other people angry or in order to make other people frustrated, where they're deliberately trying to make things difficult for us or to make our lives hard. Not as a matter of protest, that's one thing, right, when there's an inconvenience in order to get a point across, but just as a matter of creating frustration, of just lashing out. So the world can feel like it's on fire at the moment. And that's on top of the usual kind of difficulties that we have being humans, right? Where we run in and bump into other people along the way, where they don't live up to the promises they might have made, where their errors inconvenience us, or their hidden biases get in our way of trying to get something. Like, on top of the ordinary difficulties, we've got some extraordinary ones that are coming at it. All of them can leave us feeling angry. That's one emotion. It can come from it, right? That we see all this and we get angry. And initially that anger is always energizing, but usually it ends up making us feel isolated and alone. We start with this anger and saying, oh, those people are terrible. What they're doing is awful. Or we start by feeling isolated, like they can't see us, or they don't understand our needs, or they don't grasp where we're at. And even if that inspires some energy initially, it usually runs out pretty quickly. That anger can leave us open to being manipulated, and the feeling of isolation can leave us open to being manipulated. That is, people buy into these conspiracy theories, into quickly looking for solutions that are just going to do nothing, that won't make significant change. And it definitely can leave us feeling drained when the progress that we were hoping for and the progress that we wanted doesn't come about. We talked last week about some things that we could do as individuals in order to combat racism. And I mean, one of the things that's always striking is there are a number of little things you can do. One of the things that's always frustrating is that they're usually little. They don't make that big progress, that big leap. It feels like you're up against an impossible force to overcome or to deal with. And so the anger and the isolation can set in and stop us. So when we're engaged with the world, there's important parts of it that we don't see. When we're engaged in action within the world, there's important parts of it that we don't see. Countless religions have made this kind of claim, right? That we don't see the world as it is, that the world is hidden from us through some kind of veil, and that we need to engage in some sort of religious practice or meditation or yoga or any number of things in order to pull back the veil and see reality as it is. I think there's a really valuable point here, right? The world as it appears to us isn't all that there is to it. There's always something else behind it. And pausing for a moment to try to push beyond and behind it, to see what it is behind reality or behind our experience that really is the case, or even that could be thought of differently, can let us find some calm, some focus, and help us be more effective. So with the quote that I brought today from Epictetus, he's a Stoic, right? And he's saying everything has two handles. The idea here, of course, is there's two different ways, at least, in order to grasp these different situations. He's directing our attention towards the way that we manufacture the quality of our reality. Okay, that's a big sort of phrase. That is, when we build our reality, when the situation as we see it, right, gets created, there's a number of activities that we're doing that are part of creating that situation. We're thinking of it in a particular way. We are latching on to particular handles. We are grabbing particular pieces of it and highlighting those pieces. And the way that we perceive that situation, the way we grab onto those pieces, affects how we carry it, how we can deal with it. So our activities, right, are building our perception of the world. Another way to think about it, our words are loaded, right? They come to us with meanings and implications that are difficult. So when we're dealing with protests or riots, right, people bounce back and forth between those words. Those two words mean different things. They grasp different aspects. In many cases, both of them could apply, right, to the situation. There's a dimension of it that is correct. But of course, when we perceive the world, we see it only one way, only one part of it. So multiple descriptions can be true of any given situation, which is not the same as like everything is true. That's not the case. But multiple descriptions can be true. There are different ways to look at it, different ways to grab it. The rush that we get from an outrage, from that kind of a sense of things, the initial energy and action that we can get from that kind of sense of things, can be very hard to sustain. It usually dissipates. If you continue to feel outraged, but the facts don't change, then quickly you feel powerless, right? So you're outraged, but you're powerless. You're unable to change them. A lot of times the action just slips away. That is, you're outraged and you keep that up for a week or maybe two, and then you just can't anymore. You're not feeling the energy and was that you were connecting to. So we can get lost in the stories, or if we're counting on the energy, that energy can disappear from us. So we've got to think about how we're manufacturing our reality. What are we doing that chooses certain aspects to pay attention to? Epictetus, right, wants us to think about a situation where someone does us an injustice, right, and says there are two handles. You can pick it up by the injustice, or you can pick it up by the fact that it is our brother who does it, right, that you are connected to the person who does it. How does that help us manufacture our reality in a different way? How does thinking of the person who commits an injustice as our brother, right, picking it up by that handle, help us deal with the situation and engage with the situation? Well, here's some thoughts on how that might work. One, it reminds us that we are flawed too. So it's very easy when we're outraged to see other people's errors, other people's mistakes, and not be able to recognize our own, where we trip up, where we've failed. We have made mistakes in the past. So perhaps they are doing something that is unjust, that is wrong. We've done things that are unjust and wrong too. That may give us a particular situation, a particular vantage point from which to talk to them, to call it out, to connect to them, right? To say you shouldn't do that. But it shouldn't let us get high and mighty, right? As though we are above that and they are below us. To some degree, right? We are lucky to be able to see the world as we do, right? If we are right and we can see that that what they're doing is unjust, to some degree, we are lucky that we got raised in a way that made that possible, that we were given opportunities that made that possible, that we were given conversations. Now, that's not to say that maybe we tried, and took advantage of those opportunities in a way others didn't. I don't necessarily, we don't need to get into that detail. We just have to recognize that even when we're right, even when justice is on our side, we are lucky that we got raised in a way that helps us see that. That helps us be a little less harsh, right, to the people that are being unjust. It leads us to remember that we are all human, right? This is a humanist group. That's something we should be remembering. We are all human. We struggle together. We often act out of pain and confusion, right? People who are grabbing the wrong side of a situation, right, who are focusing on the wrong facts within the situation, are confused. And often they're acting out of that pain and confusion. This isn't to excuse them or just to drop it, but it does help us see their actions in a way that gives us a chance that we might be able to engage with them, right? Now, maybe they're not open to our words. That's certainly possible. That only means that they are more caught up in this cycle, right? That means they don't see how they manufacture their situation. They don't see how reality is it, or the world as it appears to them is not the whole of the world and the entirety of the world. They don't see the limitations of their point of view. That may all be true, but that's a human way to be. That's a human mistake. That's an error we're all subject to. And so that we can see that connection in them, we can see how they are like us, at least in that regard. It weakens the anger. It changes the way we perceive the situation. It makes it something that we can carry. All right, so changing the way we perceive the situation, what it is not. I think that's important. It is not the same as forgiveness, right? Being able to see someone's mistake as an error, as a failure to understand, as doing something that they think is good, right, but is really causing a lot of harm, helps you to carry it, helps you to be able to deal with it and think about how to respond. It does not necessarily excuse them. They can still be at fault, and you don't have to forgive them for it. So it's not the same as forgiving. It's not the same as writing as excuses, right? You're not saying that there's, just because they were confused, there's no guilt or there's no problem there. And it's not the same as just letting it drop. So to recognize that the person committing an injustice is your brother, right, is connected to you, is like you, doesn't mean that you just do nothing about it. What it does mean is that we find a different way to go about doing something about it, right? We might act to stop an injustice. And in that way, we are helping the person who would be a victim of the injustice. But we're also acting the person who's perpetrating. We're helping to keep them from doing that they should regret, that if they saw the situation clearly, they would regret, that they would see as separating them from something good, something valuable. If we understand the situation that way, if we see the connection that we have with other people and their similarity, we can do better about waiting for a genuine opportunity to act. You don't say the first words that come into your mouth the way you do when you're angry, right? You think about when you'll really have an opportunity to sit with them and talk and make some sort of connection. We're better to connect with things we talked about before. We're better at being still, right? And waiting for the genuine opportunity to create change. It means that we don't seek to see them suffer. The goal is not, right, to hurt them or to make them suffer for what they have done. We might seek to protect ourselves and we might seek to protect others, and that may cause some suffering on their part, but we don't seek to do that. We don't try to do that. And I think that's crucial, because when we do seek to try to make other people suffer, we often err in our efforts. We often get drawn away from making lasting change. We often get drawn away from the results that we really want, right? The changes that we want to see happen and stay in place. We get distracted, right, by efforts to make sure that the people we feel have been unjust have suffered. It means that we judge them when we do judge them, right, with a sort of sadness for their pain and confusion, rather than looking down on them as evil or depraved, right? It's regret that they can't see that what they're doing is harmful. It's regret that their perspective won't let them see how they're manufacturing this situation as one that is destructive. means we need to find, right, a basis of moving forward that we can all stand for, right, that humans can work together to create. So I wanted to think about this, in part because we talked about racism, and that's front and center. It's not the only topic this applies to, but I think that it's important for us when we want to confront something like racism to deal with it. We often throw around that word racist to cover a whole lot of different things, whether it is racial hatred from people that really ought to know better, whether it's racial hatred coming from people who've been raised in a culture that surrounds them, whether it's redlining and the effects that that has, where there may be no remaining hatred, but there's certainly separation of people. There are many different perspectives here and many different directions. And if we're not able to see the people who err as confused, as mistaken, as taking their corner of reality and projecting it as though it was the whole thing, and more importantly, if we're not able to look back at ourselves and see where we're confused and where we make mistakes and where we project our errors, then we're likely just to get locked in and be unable to talk and to be unable to think and to be unable to grasp the situation. So I think it's especially valuable to be sort of centered within yourself, to understand yourself and how you manufacture your experience, what you're doing that makes you feel and respond in various ways, because it gives you a better chance of being able to engage others productively, usefully, in ways that might bring us forward. So in terms of the questions that I have in there, right, I think it's valuable to stop and think, how do I manufacture my experience? What am I doing that makes my experience have the qualities that it has? What parts am I picking it up by, right, that makes my life either easier or harder to carry? And that last part, easier or harder to carry, is asking, is the way that I'm thinking about these situations, does it empower me? Does it make it easier for me to act? Does it make it easier for me to connect to other people? Does it make it easier for me to generate a good result? Or is the way that I'm picking the situation up undermining me? It may feel good initially, right? It may leap to mind because this is the way I've always engaged the world. But does it ultimately leave me feeling powerless and unable to do anything? If so, I need to find a different handle. All right.